We're living, as we all know, in a time of profound crisis. Rising polarization, war, environmental crises. Many of us want to do something. We care deeply, but the challenges just feel too big. It's not that we're missing heart or hope. It's not that we don't care. It's that we're looking for a vision of how ordinary people, like all of us, can respond to what's going on. And that's where Peace Heroes and these stories come in. They are guides who have found ways to respond with courage, creativity, and hope. They give us a roadmap that maybe we can follow, even in our day-to-day lives. Welcome to We Are Peace Heroes. I'm Kirsten.
And I'm Ellie.
And we are so excited to share with you another episode of We Are Peace Heroes. Today we're going to tell a story of one of our very beloved peace heroes. I think every person to whom we have told this story, no matter where in the world they are or what their context is, has fallen in love with this woman because she is just truly one of the greats of our time. And so we would like to tell you today about Wangari Maathai, a remarkable woman from Nairobi, Kenya. So Ellie, let's just dive right in. Who is Wangari Maathai?
So Wangari Maathai is a Kenyan woman who really made a massive impact in Kenya and the world. Wangari was born in the early 1940s in rural Kenya, and she was part of the Kikuyu tribe. And she grew up kind of in what was traditional back then, family homestead with her mother and father, but also her aunts and uncles and grandparents and cousins all living together in this compound in the countryside. It was a very idyllic childhood for her. And even though they had to work a lot, like the women in Kenya at that time, they kind of carried the load for providing food for the family and water. And providing food at that time meant tilling the land and harvesting the food and growing the crops, and water meant hauling it from the river. And so it was a lot of work for the women in these homesteads, but she really enjoyed just that togetherness of being with her family and being outdoors and being super curious. Like her mom saw how curious she was and gave her a little plot of land to grow her own stuff on. And so it was a very idyllic childhood, like I said, but also one that was full of work and responsibility. And at that time, girls were not usually allowed to go to school, but in Wangari's case, that changed. There was an exception. Christy, you want to tell us how that developed?
Yeah. So young girls at the time in Kenya were not expected nor usually allowed to go to school. But of course, because Wangari was so curious, she watched her brother going to school every day and absolutely insisted this was very unfair. Why couldn't she go to school? And it was in fact her brother who kind of stood up for her and proposed to their parents that she should be allowed to go to school. And remarkably, for that time and context, her parents decided he was right. And eventually they decided to give her a chance. So Wangari was one of the lucky ones who was able to go to school, and she thrived. I mean, she was bright and curious and hardworking. And so we kind of flash forward then. She did so well in school that she ended up getting a scholarship to study at a university in the United States. And so she went to the US. She got her degree in science. She went on to get her master's degree. I mean, she was really, really excelling, both as a student and as a scientist. And eventually she returned to Kenya. She ended up completing her PhD when she came back to Kenya and was actually the first woman in East Africa to receive a PhD. And so now Wangari finds herself back in Kenya. She gets a job at a university, and she really was successful and thriving, and also really still connected to her culture, her people, her family. And in Kenya, we say when you leave the city, you go up country. And so she spent still a lot of time up country out of the city, speaking with the women in rural Kenya, where she had grown up. And one of the things that she noticed as she was spending time with these women, she kept hearing over and over how these women's lives were so difficult. I mean, they just talked about how difficult it was to grow food, how difficult it was to find water, to find firewood, to feed their children, how their children were sick. Like there was so much hardship. And at first, Wangari, kind of her first thought, I mean, of course she responded with compassion, but, she thought, well, maybe this is just how it is. Like life in rural Kenya for women has always been difficult and continues to be. But what she noticed was they would often say it's not how it used to be. It used to be easier. It is getting more and more difficult. So Wangari has this moment where she's like, has something changed here? And of course, being a scientist who is looking for explanations and asking good questions, she sets out to figure out what is going on. So, Ellie, what does she discover?
Well, maybe we'll go back again to her childhood. I mean, just briefly to set the context for the Kikuyu, there's this tree in Kenya, which Kirsten, you should actually describe to our listeners since you live there and you see mugumu trees all the time. But they're these massive trees that their branches spread out and create like really enormous areas of shade. And they're considered sacred by the Kikuyu. And Wangari was taught growing up, like, you never cut down a mugumu tree. It not only feeds the people and provides shade, it also has healing qualities. Like, there's all kinds of reasons why you don't cut down the mugumu tree. And on one of these visits back home, years later, when the women were telling her about all the hardships, that they had to walk further to get water, they had to, that everyone was sick and malnourished. There was the firewood was scarce. And one of the things that she also learned, much to her shock, was that the mugumu tree that she had like grown up considering sacred had been cut down. And I think that realization made her look around the landscape and see what she hadn't really noticed before in great detail, was how a lot of trees had been cut down. They've been cut down to make room for tea and coffee plantations. So, the hillsides are still green and beautiful. If you go to Kenya now, you see these plantations and they're really lovely. But the trees had been cut down to make room for them. And that was her aha moment, where she suddenly thought, that's what's changed. There are no longer trees around like there were when I was a child. And that has affected the entire environment. So before we move on with her story, Kristen, do you want to tell us a little bit about the impact of deforestation, like what it means when you cut down trees, what that does to the environment, and why this was affecting the people in rural places in Kenya, the women especially?
Yeah, if you'll just let me nerd out here for a bit. This topic is very fascinating to me. And really briefly, just for the history of Kenya, just to kind of give it a bit of background, Kenya was colonized by the British. And this practice of deforestation began already way back during the colonial period, where, of course, the British were coming in, they were taking over the resources, they were clearing the land already way back then. I mean, horrible things. Like they were clearing land to make room for these so-called refugee camps for all of the local people that they were displacing. This practice goes way back and sets an unfortunate precedent and pattern into the country because, unfortunately, even after independence, we now have Kenyan governments come in, but the deforestation only continues and increases, truthfully. It's such a quick way to make money. And there's all these reasons why the governments just continue to actually increase this practice of simply cutting down all of the gorgeous trees of Kenya for profit, essentially. And unfortunately, even as systems of inequality and more people are being disenfranchised and impoverished and displaced, and then, of course, even the impoverished people, of course, they start to cut down trees around them because they need the firewood and they want to make a quick place to have plants and, or they need charcoal. Like there's so many factors here. But all that to say, by the time we're here in like the 1980s, so much of Kenya has been deforested. I mean, just huge swaths of this gorgeous land wiped bare. And what happens now, this is not a story unique to Kenya. Anywhere you are in the world, you may think you're just cutting down trees. And so maybe, it's not as pretty and maybe there's not as much firewood. There are some things that are sort of obvious. But what actually happens, and I apologize if you know this, maybe I'm just stating the obvious here, but just so we're all on the same page, trees do so much for a region. So, they hold the topsoil in place, and you need the topsoil to stay in place in order to grow crops and healthy fruits and vegetables. So you cut down the trees, and suddenly you're losing your soil, and suddenly you can't plant the same food that has always been healthy for your family. So now your children are malnourished, and now everyone's a little bit sick. And so then maybe they're not going to school. I mean, it goes and goes. These issues are so interconnected. Trees, of course, they regulate the climate. They bring rain and waterfall. And so when you cut down the trees, now you have less rain. Not only are you losing the topsoil, but you're depleting the rainfall. So, of course, this is all connected to why deforestation is so connected to desertification. The deserts of our world are growing because when you cut down the trees, eventually, before very long at all, you're left with desert. Truthfully, it's a disturbingly rapid process. And then that not only leaves you, of course, malnourished, not having water, and so on, but then you're also losing your land and you're moving to where maybe there is a bit more water. Now you're encroaching on other people's land. And now you've got new conflicts arising. And then, of course, you made reference to even, medicinal properties of trees for a lot of communities or shelter for animals. And, there's just so many factors of what happens, the seemingly simple, unfortunate action of cutting down trees, how actually you are impacting everything about the surrounding region, the climate, the communities, the health of the people, the peace of the area. I mean, it's just devastating. But I should probably stop there so we can get back to Wangari's story. So Wangari sees this, right? She sees these impacts that cutting down the trees is having in Kenya, and this feels like a very overwhelming problem. I mean, if the government and all the wealthy people are cutting down the trees and it's destroying communities, I mean, what could one woman who grew up in rural Kenya, what in the world could she do? It feels very helpless. So over to you, Ellie. What happens? What does Wangari do with this overwhelming helplessness?
She was overwhelmed at first, because I think it's also important here to mention that even though she had accomplished so much and she was back in Kenya and she was working at a university, Wangari never stopped encountering a lot of backlash because she was a woman. She had to keep fighting for her position at the university, for legitimacy, for people to believe her, take her seriously. I mean, just like when she was a girl. And so she's constantly battling this mindset that belittles women. And here she's made this huge discovery about how this industry of deforestation, which is being spearheaded by the government's making a lot of money off of it. It's powerful men in government, powerful businessmen in the country. They're the ones who are spearheading this initiative. And she's not only one person, but she's a woman. That was like double powerlessness. She's from rural Kenya and she's a woman. What in the world could she do? She knew it was really important, but how was she going to fight against the system? Right. And so she thought about it and she suddenly had a revelation, which now when we tell the story, it's so simple. You think, how did that take so long to get to that? But I think sometimes the simplest answers are the hardest to come to because we disqualify them because they're too simple. And so I don't know, Kristen, do you want to share her aha moments? It's such a fun moment in the story.
Yeah. So here she is, and she suddenly realizes, wait, this is so simple. We can't change the system. I mean, the government isn't changing anytime soon. But you know what I can do right now is I could plant a tree. I mean, if the problem is we don't have enough trees, why don't I plant a tree? And she started planting trees on the most basic, simple level, finding seeds, growing little seedlings, putting them in the ground and growing trees. And she's like, wait, we can do this. Not just we, the people, but specifically we, the women. The women are bearing the brunt of the impact of all this deforestation. And she suddenly realizes if we, the women, are motivated, we can start solving this problem we are facing by simply planting trees in our yards and in our communities. And Wangari is so excited, she's like, we can do this. Let's plant trees. So she goes to the women and she says, I'm going to teach you how to plant trees and you are going to change everything. And how did the women respond to that, Ellie?
They were like, no, we can't do it. Thank you, but no, thank you. We're too small. And I love this part in her story. This is actually from her autobiography, which I highly recommend. Like the women turn her down flat. They just say, thanks, but no thanks. See you later. And she gets it. Like she understands. They've been told all their lives that they are too small to make a difference. They're too small to go to school. Like they're too insignificant to learn. This is what's been drilled into them. And so they're saying to Wangari, sorry, only men can plant trees. They actually go to university, get degrees in tree planting. We can't do that. And she's standing there looking at the women. And this is a direct quote from her book. She looks at them and she says, use your woman sense. You have been planting crops for generations. Like you know how to dig a little in the earth, put a seedling in, water it. You've been carrying that load for your families for generations. Of course, you know how to plant trees. And when she says that to them, it's like they have their aha moment. They realize, wait a minute, of course we can plant trees. Why did we think we can't? It's because of the narrative that had been, passed down to them also from generation to generation about what women can or can't do. So after that first little mini fiasco, she gets the women on board and she helps them to plant their little seeds, grow the seedlings, plant them in the earth. And she also has another incentive for them, which is for every seedling that actually like grows, that doesn't die, she gives each woman 10 cents or something the equivalent of. And so there's also this element of economic empowerment because it's very hard for women to be economically independent in rural Kenya at this time. And so by actually giving them a tiny bit of money for every tree that grows, she's also in some way giving them access to more independence than they've ever had. So it's kind of like this, not only solving the environmental problem, but it's also empowering the women in ways that they haven't been empowered before. So
Yeah.
they start to plant trees. And Kirsten, what happens next?
Yeah, I mean, it's just so cool. They literally start changing the face of Kenya. Women all over the country start planting trees. And little by little, the green returns to their communities. The water returns remarkably quickly. The soil becomes richer. I mean, all across the country, these small pockets of women are planting trees. And not only are they changing their communities, but they're reversing the problems that they have been experiencing themselves for so long. It was so empowering and inspiring that they could see that their actions were actually bringing healing and hope and health to their families and their communities. It was incredible. So like Ellie said, they started to have a sense of empowerment. Like they realized, wait, we didn't have to wait for the system to change. We changed this ourselves, and it gave them so much power. And as you can, unfortunately, maybe predict, this becomes a problem. Suddenly, the powerful men of this country and the government and the business elite, when they suddenly realized that there was a whole group of people feeling empowered, which of course makes them much less easy to control, they realized this was a problem for them, and they began to harass the women. They began to harass Wangari, and we won't go into all of the details, but it truly was horrible. Wangari was imprisoned. She was beaten. I mean, there was so much that was happening because when people are depending on fear and powerlessness in order to control them, then they feel like they need to suppress any sense of empowerment. Unfortunately, we see that in too many places in the world. And that was the story for these women in Kenya. However, may it be known, Wangari refused to back down. She would not play into their tactics of fear. In fact, every time they tried to cow her or arrest her, she just became stronger. I mean, it's amazing. Even when they arrested her, of course, and you see this throughout history, the people knew this was happening, and it sparked even more resolve in all of them, and in the women, especially of Kenya. And so this movement just grew and grew and grew, despite the government's best efforts to try to stop it. And that movement that Wangari started, they began to call it the Green Belt movement. It grew and grew not only across Kenya, this green belt of trees, but soon to surrounding countries. I'll just flash forward for a moment. Her campaign and her commitment first was to plant 1 million trees. And everybody laughed at her. Every man in power said that is absolutely ludicrous. Women can't plant trees, they'll never do it. Well, by today, that goal has become part of the 1 trillion tree campaign. I mean, these women in these small pockets planting one little seedling at a time, it has grown immeasurably and really changed the reality in Kenya and in so many places all around the world, actually.
I think that up till today, or I don't have the exact latest number, but a few years ago when we were doing the research, the Green Belt movement had actually already planted 15 billion trees around the world. So amazing, huge impact from one woman who planted one seedling as a way of countering deforestation. Like it went from that to now this trillion tree campaign that the Green Belt movement is a huge part of. So Kristen, like what was the end result of that specific moment in time for Wangari in Kenyan history?
Well, maybe the most public marker of her impact was she went on to win the Nobel Peace Prize for her efforts. Because, of course, the intersection between environmental restoration and peace building was so clear and direct. Poverty reduction and peace building, it's also connected. The world noticed, and they noticed her efforts at planting trees really went so beyond the trees themselves. And was actually establishing peace and security for millions of people around the world. So she won the Nobel Peace Prize. She also continued to work in Kenya. She continued her activist work. She worked in the government. She had so much impact on so many sectors of Kenya. Unfortunately, she ended up dying of ovarian cancer at the age of 71. But like I said, her legacy continues to resonate. We have had the great honor of telling Wangari Maathai's story in so many places, in so many communities and schools where Peace Heroes has been involved. We almost always start with this story because it is so remarkable, it's so empowering, and so many people can connect to it. So, for example, let me just tell you, we could tell stories for an hour, but one of the stories that, of course, sticks in our hearts and minds is when we told the story of Wangari Maathai to the Yazidi girls in northern Iraq. They were living in a refugee camp, and we were able to do online Peace Heroes classes with them. If you've listened to our other episodes, we have mentioned this before, but these girls had been rescued from enslavement to ISIS and were now living in a refugee camp. The layers of trauma were unending. And we chose the story of Wangari Maathai to tell the girls first. And because it was our first story, we didn't quite recognize, I don't think, what we were walking into, maybe. Ellie, there were so many beautiful moments from that time, but do you remember the surprise when we first told this story? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, wow. I mean, it was such an amazing experience with them. So one of the things that stands out to me, even before we started telling them about Wangari's story, was just we gave them a little introduction to Kenya. We had slideshows. We were using translation, so we were using a lot of imagery to tell the stories, and just showing them like pictures of Kenya and birds in Kenya and rural Kenya, and it was just like for them, it was so awe-inspiring, like to just see another part of the world that was so different from where they were. Like it was, you could just see like stars in their eyes. Like they were just so amazed at how beautiful Kenya was. That was the first thing that I think we realized, like they were just lapping it up. They were drinking this beauty from another part of the world. But I think what really surprised both of us when we started telling the story, we talked about Wangari's childhood. And the thing that the girls, all these girls connected to, or what resonated with them the most, was that Wangari had not been allowed to go to school when she was a girl. And for them, that was like, oh, she's just like us. We were deprived. We were not allowed to go to school. All the years that they were enslaved, they were denied school. And now they were just at that point of starting to rebuild their lives after having been rescued. They were in this refugee camp. We need to mention that they were with Springs of Hope Foundation, our partners that were working there on the ground. They're starting to rebuild their lives. And part of that was just having access again to education and having this ability to step into that world that they had been deprived of. And that was their point of connection with Wangari. And I think you and I were so surprised. We hadn't considered that. We hadn't thought about that. But that was how they entered into her story. And right from the get-go, like Wangari as a girl, Wangari as a child, they already felt like a kinship to her, even though she's from a completely different part of the world, from a part of the world that like looks so different from anything they've ever seen. They immediately felt like, oh, we get her. She's like one of us. She wasn't allowed to go to school. And that was their point of entry into the story. And it made her feel like a friend to them already from the beginning.
Yeah, exactly. It was really remarkable. And truthfully, that's what we find over and over with this story. People can connect to her, and not only do they find some way of relating, but the amazing part is the final outcome where, as she said herself, she said, each of us can do one small thing. My one small thing is planting trees. What will your one small thing be? And that has become really one of the centering themes for us in all of our work, because we all know, not only our young people, our children, but each of us right now, I mean, everything feels very overwhelming. And when you think in your own context that we need a huge system change, how do we change these entire systems? I'm not powerful enough. We feel so helpless. And then you hear Wangari Maathai and she says, you can do one small thing. And that, of course, resonated with those girls in northern Iraq. They were so excited. They started talking about like, okay, what's why one small thing? And some of it was actually planting trees in their refugee camp. They wanted to bring plants to make it more beautiful. But for some of them, they realized, my one small thing is visiting the elderly woman that lives in the tent beside me and helping her with her chores. There was just this real transformation of, I don't need to be a victim and I don't need to be helpless. Like I can do one small thing. And I think that's the main takeaway from Wangari's story, maybe for each of us, that we've seen so often. Ellie, I already kind of talked about how I just feel really inspired by this idea that each of us can make a difference where we are, and we don't need to wait for the powerful system to change, that the change begins with us. I just can't get over how relevant that feels for me and so many people I know. But when you were listening and telling the story again today, is there anything that specifically stood out to you as really important from Wangari's story?
I mean, like you said, I'll just affirm what you said, that she's kind of become our model story for what it means to do one small thing. Literally, the act of planting a seed is as small an act as you can do, and look at the impact it's had. So that is always such a key theme whenever we're thinking, or whenever I'm thinking about Wangari. It's just a reminder of doing one small thing. One of the parts of her story that has also had equal impact when we've been telling it to different groups is the way that she was kind of like a scientist from birth. And you know, in some of our resources that we have online, by the way, they're available on the website. We have Wangari in multiple different formats that you can download. But one of the things that we kind of hone in on is how she used what she was good at and what she loved to do, like her curiosity and like to eventually become a scientist. And that is what she used to actually, you know, create a solution to this big problem. I mean, starting small, but it was still like using what she loved and what she was good at. And over the years, that has also become a key theme as we've taken this story to kids, basically. And we say, she loved science. She loved biology. She loved learning. And look at the change she made through that. What are your dreams? What do you love to do? And we've talked about this in other podcasts, but just to say, that always stands out to me with Wangari, because it's such a reminder that each of us can take a moment to think about what it is that we love, and then we can use that to look at the world around us and see how we can have an impact. So I was just remembering that this morning, specifically because of a recent visit to a school I made in Bethlehem in the West Bank, where that was the part of the story that they were learning, was just the very, very beginning of who she was as a child. And I sat in the classroom listening to all these kids talk about their dreams. What do they want to do? Like, where do they want to get to in life? And then how can they use that? And so just sitting in that classroom and seeing that Wangari's story was like the jumping off point for these kids to dream big about themselves by taking small steps to get there, like, was really encouraging. So for today, that's the part of her story that stands out to me. Although I think every time I read her story again, there's something else, because there's so many aspects of it that are so inspiring.
I'll add one more thing. We touched on this idea of how everything is interconnected, this idea of intersectionality. I talked about it specifically with the trees, and the downside of how issues are like domino effects. You know, cutting down a tree can cause the water to be lost, can cause people to be sick, and so on and so on. So many of the issues of the world are interconnected. None of them are in isolation. And we talk about that a lot when we talk about Wangari's story. And for a lot of young people, that's really eye-opening. You know, they've never heard it that way, that gender inequality is connected to poverty and so on. But in some ways, that is so discouraging because one bad thing that happens can have so much negative impact. However, the flip side of that, and what Wangari's story really shows us, is that the opposite is also true, because everything is so intersected. When we make one small change, I think this can be environmental, but it can be in any way, like small acts of kindness or welcome or inclusion or environmental care. There's so many different ways we can make one small step towards healing something that is broken, and everything is interconnected. And so the domino effect, the ways that other things then can change and heal, it's just so hopeful. Like, we can make a big impact by doing small things because they're all so connected. And I find that really hopeful when I think about Wangari and her story. So for now, that's another story of a peace hero for each of you. I think it's obvious maybe that the call to action for each of us today is simply to ask, what will our one small thing be? Even just this week, one small act of care or peace building or planting a tree. We can all be peace heroes, and we really can change this world. So like Ellie said, there are resources available on our website. If you want to learn more about Wangari's story or share it with your students or your children or your friends, please go to globalpeaceheroes.org and find those resources there. Thank you so much for joining us, because we believe that peace isn't just a dream. It's a choice and it's a path. And it starts here with the stories we choose to tell and the actions we choose to take.